Hundreds of thousands of Americans have joined nationwide protests against President Donald Trump's trade tariffs and the radical shakeup of U.S. politics driven by his administration. Hands-off rallies have been held in all 50 states. There's growing public anger at Trump's policies as well as Elon Musk's cost-cutting campaign.
It was the largest single day of protest since President Donald Trump returned to office in January. Under the banner Hands Off, opponents of Trump's policies rallied, from critics of his economic policies to those concerned about civil rights, to climate activists in towns and cities in all 50 states, from New York's Fifth Avenue.
I feel horrible. Immigrants are getting deported. The president's so worried about 0.1% of the population, transgender people, but he doesn't care about the economy, he doesn't talk about lowering prices, inflation.
To Charlotte, North Carolina.
I'm here today as a person with a disability to stand up for all the 70 million people in America who receive disability, who receive Medicaid or Medicare. They are important. Their voice is important.
In Houston, Texas, people came out in defiance of a tornado warning.
I'm here today to say hands off of our democracy, hands off of our rights, hands off of our futures. I was a little afraid today that the weather might scare people from coming out, but I was so delighted to see that everyone braved the rainy weather and came out to fight for our democracy.
In the capital, Washington, D.C., demonstrators congregated on the National Mall.
We object to everything that Donald Trump is doing, basically in terms of his power grab and all the damage he's doing to the economy and to democracy.
In a nation as divided as the United States, the hands-off organizers managed to bring together a wide range of those unhappy with the government, from civil rights organizations to army veterans to LGBTQ groups to climate activists. They all had one message for the man in the Oval Office.
This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
For more, let's speak now to William Glucroft, who's a U.S. analyst and the deputy editor of the Parliament magazine. Always good to see you, William. What do you make of these protests? Might this ignite a groundswell of a much larger, more substantive movement, or is this simply the predictable frustration from largely Democratic strongholds?
Well, according to the organizers themselves, this was a one-day protest for April 5th. So at least for now, it seems like kind of just a cathartic expression, one-off kind of thing. These things do have a way of taking off and sort of snowballing into larger events. We saw in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, for example, that rocked the United States across the country in many different sort of settings and contexts for that entire summer. To what extent or to what the long-term sort of consequences of that was, I think, that's quite unclear. But right now, this was sort of a one-off thing. And I can't help but note the timing of this, that, the things that these protesters are calling out have been going on now, not just for the weeks of the Trump's second term, but really through the course of, modern U.S. history. But it only comes to a fruition now in the days after Donald Trump's announcement on tariffs basically tanked the global economy with a very uncertain future for everybody. So the timing for me here is quite notable.
We are not hearing much public pushback from Trump's own party. How likely is it the demands of the protesters will resonate with right-leaning constituents who were never enamored with Trump but believed he was a far better choice than the Democrats?
It depends on the messaging, right? And it depends on what Democrats are going to do, if anything, to sort of paint a different vision, an alternative, another future other than what Donald Trump is offering. Because remember, the reason or a reason that the Democrats lost so handily is not because Donald Trump is so great. He's actually quite an unfavorable president across the board. It's because Democrats are hated even more because they're seen as out of touch with most Americans, not providing a future that people want to be part of, defending status quo that's not working for a lot of people. And Donald Trump, whether it's for good, bad, or otherwise, is providing an idea of something else. Now, that's a very destructive something else. It's a something else that doesn't come with a day after plan, but nonetheless, it's something else. And when people are this desperate for some kind of change, where they see the massive inequality happening across the United States and has been for decades, this is not a Donald Trump product, we have to remember. This is decades of presidents, Republicans, Democrats alike, saying the government is bad and we have to let markets sort of find our way through this. Then you're left with what Donald Trump is offering and not something that many people might want to jump in on and be part of. So it really depends on what the response is going to be now.
We should mention this wave of protests has reached Berlin, Paris, and London to some extent. Does that amount to anything?
Based on what I've read and what I've experienced, it's mostly Americans living abroad, especially Democrats living abroad. I don't see a lot of Europeans. I mean, they're protesting and aghast in other ways, but of course, there's plenty of democracy rollback in European countries. Seeing Hungary step out of the International Criminal Court, Germany looking to deport EU citizens for their own political beliefs. There's plenty to worry about in Europe without having to get into U.S. politics.
That's William Glucroft, U.S. analyst and the deputy editor of the Parliament magazine, as ever. Many thanks, William.
Well, our Washington correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber, told me the marchers are protesting about a wide range of grievances.
A lot of food for thought indeed. Here in DC, at least what we saw there at the National Mall was a very diverse crowd that went out to protest with many different issues that were raised not only here in Washington but in many other cities in the United States, even some European capitals too. Here in DC, some protested against what they call is an authoritarian overreach. They call this a billionaire-backed agenda, focusing their criticism on Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, also known as DOGE. Some showed support for USAID and the Department of Education. I also saw some Ukrainian flags, some Palestinian flags, protesters calling out the White House's stance on the war in Ukraine and also on US support for Israel. And others, as we just heard, that also criticized the Democratic Party, accusing them of being too passive, as we heard one of the protesters there. But there's one thing in common here, and it's that they're not happy with the direction where this country is heading to due to the policies of the Trump administration, Anthony.
Ben, are these protests big enough to make much of an impression? Are they having much of an impact?
So these protests that we saw in many different cities across the US, more than 1,000 events that were planned across the country, and also in some European capitals, in Berlin, in Paris, and in London. They constitute the largest single day of action since Trump was sworn into office for a second term. But I'd say the bigger question is now, one, will protesters keep the pressure up on Democrats, but also on Republicans? And will the Trump administration listen to them? We're still waiting for more reactions from the White House and also from President Trump, who spent his Saturday playing golf at one of his resorts in Florida.
Trump's tariffs shook the world this week. Now he's urging people in the States to, quote, hang tough. Do you get the sense of how willing Americans are to hang tough with a high cost of living on the horizon?
One of the main campaign promises of Trump was to lower inflation, to lower prices. He campaigned heavily on the economy, accusing former President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris of not doing enough to lower the prices of everyday goods and services. But these new tariffs are expected to create the increase, so the opposite, to increase the cost of many products and services, as many analysts are now saying or looking into. And that will be interesting when that happens and consumers in the US feel the big question will be for those who voted for Trump, Will they still continue to support him, support the policies, or will some of them not be willing to hang tough, as President Trump says, with the higher cost of living? Trump hasn't been in office for 100 days in this second term, but we see the criticism growing. The big question is now if many that supported him will regret their vote and be against these new policies that the White House is implementing when it comes to worldwide trade.
Benjamin Alvarez, Gruber in Washington, thank you.